We move to agenda item 5.01, Fiscal Review Committee Report. And I believe this evening we have John Walden and Vaughn Bell to present the presentation for our Fiscal Review Committee.
Good evening. President Byrd, members of the board, Dr. Kellogg, Mr. Hershiser. My name is John Walden, and together with Pastor Vaughn Bell, we are here tonight to provide a report from the district's Fiscal Review Committee. Before I get started, though, at least say I think it's a little bit sunnier out now, and I want to get you in a good mood just by recalling Saturday night's victory by the Westerville South basketball team. So congratulations to Coach Kalo and the members of the team. I'm sure you'll talk about that later, but I want you in a good mood first. In addition to Vaughn and myself, the committee consisted of various community members, district officials, and 2 members of the Board of Education. The complete description will be set forth on your last slide. The purpose of the committee was really threefold. That was to examine the financial data of the district, and Mr. Griffith and other district officials helped lead us through a 5-year forecast. I think the board last saw one in October, and we'll see another one in May of this year. Some of the numbers we saw that are a working copy of that. Also, part of the purpose is to understand the potential levy renewal options. Vaughn will talk about that a little bit more detail as we go on. And then finally, the third purpose of the group was to provide a recommendation from our committee about what the district should do with respect to the soon-to-be expiring 2012 emergency levy that's on the books. With that understood, Vaughn is going to give you a little bit more about the process that we undertook as part of the review committee.
Good evening. The process was a relatively simple one. The committee came together. We met we had 3 meetings over the course of the months of February and the beginning of March. In those meetings, we did an overview of the district's current financial status by reviewing the 5-year forecast. We reviewed the 5 options that are available to you as the board in terms of options available with the levy. We discussed the options and arrived at a consensus. And in that discussion process, we not only talked amongst ourselves, but part of what we were charged and asked to do was to speak with family, friends, neighbors throughout the community to also be able to gauge the communities where they were to get there so that they would have some input into the process as well. And so we put all of that together, the opinions and the views of the committee combined with those that we received from talking to community members. And then the process will conclude here this evening with a recommendation being made to you from the committee.
So a little more about what we discussed in the meetings. As the board is aware, in March 2012, the community passed an emergency levy that provided revenue to allow the district to restore some programming that was cut after the failure of a November 2011 levy. At that time, when we were having expenses were exceeding revenue, so some drastic cuts had to be made by the board. After the community passed the levy, and during actually the time leading up to the levy, the board advised the community that the additional money raised by that emergency levy would only projected to last 3 years. But through good management, some sound financial decisions, the district has been able to stretch those dollars so that the cash balance could maintain for at least 8 years, which is 5 years longer than was projected at the time we passed it in March 2012. And this is with adding an additional programming that was cut previously to that process. As you can see, some of the numbers. As shown on the slide, the district will continue to spend less than it receives in revenue until fiscal year 18. Although I'm sure the board is aware, for purposes of the audience and others that are either listening to this or whatever, a fiscal year for the district is July 1 through June 30th. And it's, if the district takes no action with respect to the expiring levy, the district will lose approximately $8.3 million in fiscal year 18, followed by $16.7 million in fiscal year 19, which then would require the district to use savings to existing savings to maintain the programming that we currently have. But in the review of the committee, taking that action does not make business sense. And while Vaughn will explain it further, not reviewing the levy would impact the community and district even more so, because in 2013, the state, as part of its budget process, the state eliminated the property tax rollbacks of 10% for non-commercial property and 2.5% for owner-occupied credit, which in layman's terms effectively means that the state picks up the first 10 to 12.5% of a taxpayer's levy responsibility. So when this levy expires, if nothing is done, then we would lose the ability to have the state pick up that portion of any subsequent levy the district might pass under current law. And with that understanding, we reviewed the levy options, and as Vaughn stated, that occurred with input from our friends and neighbors about options that we might take. Vaughn?
The 5 options that were presented that were to be considered, the first option was to renew the emergency levy as is. So to put an exact same copy of what we have now, to place that on the levy. So another 5-year emergency levy. The second option was to renew the emergency levy, but to renew it for a term other than 5 years, more than 5 years. So it could be for 5 years, 7 years, or up to 10 years. The third option was to renew the emergency levy as a substitute levy. In doing so, this would allow the district to receive additional revenue from any new construction that takes place within the district. This is an option that's new here in the state of Ohio. First became available in 2008, and it could be introduced as either a continuing levy, which means it would be ongoing, it would be permanent, or it could be for a set period of time of any length between 5 to 10 years. So with that option as a substitute levy, you could either make it continuing, or you could set a time limit for it between 5 to 10 years. The fourth option that was considered was to actually do nothing, to let the current emergency levy expire, and then the district would then have to make some decisions as to what to do with the $16.7 million deficit that would occur. And then the fifth and final option was to do nothing, to let the current emergency levy expire, but then to place some other kind of levy initiative on the ballot during calendar year 2017. So let it expire and then turn around and put something else on the ballot. So those were the 5 options that were considered. During our second meeting in the month of February, we came back together as a group, compiled, talked about, had conversation about what we thought as individual committee members, talked about our exchanges with other community members, and then we utilized what's known as the dot technique. We were all given stickers, little dots, 3 different colors, red, yellow, and green. The green represented a favorable option. Yellow, people were unsure. And then the red dots, it was unfavorable. People didn't really consider or care for that particular option. So each committee member was given dots, and then each one of the 5 different options was placed on a flip chart page that was put up on the wall. The committee members then took their dots of the 3 different colors and placed their dots up on the board according to the feedback that they received from other community members and themselves. This was done to see if it wasn't scientific by any stretch of the imagination, but what it did provide us with is a visual of the feedback a visual image for us to be able to see if there were any trends, if any one of the 5 options jumped out head and shoulders above the rest. And so once we walked through that process, we arrived at the recommendation that the committee wanted to present to the board this evening. Once we walked through that process and had internal conversations, it is the recommendation of the committee that you place on the ballot, renew a substitute levy for a continuing period of time. So to actually place a continuing substitute levy on the ballot. And now John will talk a little bit more about some of the reasoning and rationale behind why that's the committee's recommendation.
Thank you, Vaughn. And going back, I think it was clear when he talked about what I talked a little bit about a couple slides ago and what Vaughn talked about just previously, what we called items 4 and 5, which were the do-nothing items. It became pretty clear among the committee that neither of those options, in part for the part about the rollback portion, made no sense. We're still going to need this revenue. So there was nothing showing that would actually replace that revenue. And if we're ultimately going to have to go get a new levy at some point in time, then we should take advantage of what the law allows us for the rollbacks, as opposed to merely letting a levy roll off and then go try to get a new levy where we don't get those benefits for the actual taxpayers. So items 4 and 5 were quickly, not quickly, but after getting the consideration from the input from others and the process that we went through, were pretty much taken off the board in terms of most of our thoughts. With respect to what led us to reach the substitute levy for a continuing period of time is, in part, so all 3 involve renewing the levy. And what that means is you already have a levy, it's already on the books. We pay it now, it's just going to be a renewal of some kind, even if we change the name. So we're not dealing with a new tax. What we also allows us to do with the substitute portion, and we've seen that in looking out and doing some research that other districts have already undertaken this approach. It also comes with the understanding that we're ultimately, based on the funding of school districts in the state, going to need new money at some point in time. So what we're worried about as we go through this process is setting up and having a renewal levy. Let's say if we just renewed this levy for another 5 years, at the same time we did that, we might end up having a requirement for new money. And as we know, trying to put on 2 levies at the same time brings you levy fatigue. And we already know what that's happened. We've gone through it, we believe, for most of us in this district in previous times. It also allows us to, as I said, maintain the property tax rollbacks and combine the understanding that we are going to need money in the future. So that's what led to us, when you put it all together, and the 5 options that we considered led us to bring you the recommendation that Vaughn talked about. And really, that's kind of where we've ended up. We appreciate the opportunity to have us participate and looking at the district's finances and considering options of what to do going forward. As I said before, the last slide is really just a thank you to those that participated, and that gives a name. And really, from that presentation, leads us to the next slide, which is what, if any, questions you might have for us tonight. We know it's really going to be up to the board to make a decision about where we go and next steps. But anything we can do to answer questions, we're more than happy to do so.
And I know Bill's here, Bill Merriman's here, who was in the committee as well, and I didn't see if any of the other committee members came in, but Bill, if there's anything else you want to offer as well, feel free, but turn over to the board.
Question?
Questions?
2. Well, I have more, but these 2 go together. When you were talking with the community members that you talked with, on the one hand, what points seem to be the hardest to communicate around these particular issues? And on the other hand, what points seem to resonate most fully with the people you talk to?
Members of the board, Mr. Baker, for me at some point it was explaining Going to your first question was, what was the hardest point? I think it was describing the substitute portion. It's a newer law, 2008 is when it came into play, and understanding that, and I think some of it has to do with the levy lingo, because we have the temporary, what I would call in layman's terms, a temporary levy is called an emergency levy. So it's a set period of time. And then understanding that you could actually renew a levy with what you call a substitute, which would mean it's not new. So I mean, again, just my stating that shows you it's really that clear. So that was more the difficult part to understand, that we could make it a substitute levy, which would capture some of the growth, that, what remaining growth we might have from construction, property, new houses, albeit not as much as when the district faced before, but we do know there's some developments going on. That would not be just, I believe it doesn't have the impact of House Bill 920, which kind of prevents us from realizing the full growth of past levies as is. So that was the hardest part. And on the second part, I think, even if the people that I communicated with, I think to a T, everyone agreed that there should be a renewal, that we don't want to lose the rollbacks. It just makes common business sense that fits with, that makes the most sense. So if you're going to have to renew it, if you're going to have to get new money anyway, everyone seemed to agree upon that you need to renew it in some fashion. And then there were some that, that you could see maybe pros and cons in any of the first three, but long-term understanding what the district is going to face and knowing how we fund our schools in Ohio, that you're always going to have to ultimately seek a levy of some point, making it a continuing levy so that you don't have competing levies so close in time were, I think, more attractive to the people I spoke with.
Thank you.
Any additional questions this evening?
Maybe just along the lines of, and Vaughn or Bill, if you want to chime in here, and John, no, you're doing fine. I really want to dive a little more deeply into the conversations you had with people in the community, because I know that your charge was to bring us your best sense of this, but to also go into the community and just really talk to people. So the idea of what was hardest to communicate, what was helpful to kind of clarify, the continuing substitute and then emergency, when you talk about emergency, really like bells should be going off. Well, no, it's not that kind of emergency. It's kind of an emergency. Well, that's just loopy to me as well as confusing to community. Was there anything else that you would say during the discussion of the group when you all were meeting together and when you were talking to your individual friends, coworkers, community, neighbors, that you would say, this piece of it really seemed to capture them in a positive or in a negative way?
I would have to say the first hurdle that we had to get over was the language, people getting used to the language. The word emergency, it does scare people because in general terms, it communicates that there's really something wrong here and we've got to do something right now. There's a fire, the building's burning down, so it's an emergency, we got to put the fire out. But once most of these conversations that I had were probably in the neighborhood between a half hour to 45 minutes, because by the time you start walking down through the implications of each of the 5 different options, it's a lot to kind of take in. And so for me, I also became a little better informed. I became a lot more informed being part of the process as to how the funding process works. I don't think most people actually understand how school funding works. And so to then have to walk through 5 different options, sometimes it would take 10, 15 minutes of just explaining a little bit of the background detail before you start hitting the different options. So a lot of people also didn't understand that as the board, that you had all of these different options to choose from. And so I think another theme that stuck out that hit people in a positive light, even after going down through all the 5 options, when I would just make the statement and say, no new taxes. Okay, it's just a continuing the funding level that we currently have, no new taxes. But if you let it fall off, if we put something else on the ballot, then it's going to be a 12.5% hit for most of you.
And do you feel like that was a significant piece of capturing people's attention when you said nothing will revert to, doing nothing will someday revert to what would amount to an additional 12.5%?
Yes.
You feel like that kind of, and I'm just so appreciative of what you all have done, really, the gang, the whole committee, very appreciative. And I know I'm really kind of teasing out Nancy's question. I know it's the same kind of thing, but it seems to me this is really so important that if we are going to go this direction, that we are able to provide people with just very clear language in this is what's recommended and this is why it's recommended, because, and I'm going to be quiet here, because we know that ballot language is usually not very clear. So in what we say, we need to be more than clear. And so that's why I'm teasing out from both of you, and again, Bill, if you have anything, just teasing out from both of you, okay, you feel like that kind of captures the conversations that you had in the community. We want to know, capturing those conversations that you had in the community. It sounds like it was all about, this is not an additional tax, it's continuing. Emergency doesn't mean the school district is calling 911 and we're in trouble. And it, in fact, will capture a law that has been changed, the 10%, the 2.5%, the 12% overall. Am I teasing that out too much, or you understand why I'm really kind of working with that?
For me, yes. I think, now, personally, one of the things that really concerned me was if you went with another option and not a continuing option, the thing that would scare me would be when, because at some point in time, you're going to have 2 levies coming back that you're going to have to deal with at the same time, where you're going to have to come back to the community and ask for new money, and that's going to collide with you having to come back and ask for a renewal of this renewal. And so you're going to have 2 different levies on the ballot at the same time, and as a board, you're going to have to turn around and communicate that to the community. And I saw how challenging that was just in the conversations I've had with walking down through those different options. So to have 2 on the ballot at the same time, or even within close proximity to each other, most people, I think, would probably at that point say, you don't know what you're doing, I'm voting no on everything.
Right, and clearly the battling of the levies is something we want to avoid. So really, thank you for letting me tease that out a little bit. Thanks, guys.
But I just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity to participate in this process, and also to let you know that the community members that I did talk to, every one of them, without exception, wanted me to communicate to you and to Dr. Kellogg how much they appreciate 2 things. Number one was your transparency in this process, and secondly, your willingness to include them in the conversation, because they said so often they don't feel like they're even included in the conversation. So they said, be sure to tell them thank you. So thank you.
If I could just quickly expound on kind of what Vaughn said in my discussions, and even my own thoughts, were that We did a good job. You've done a good job, the district, the board, the previous board, I mean, with the board in general, and the district, of making it, so we weren't here in 2014 telling you why we had to have another levy. So we went past the projections. We've done it, with adding some of the programming back that was lost, while looking for smart opportunities to add in additional programming, whether it be additional busing or some of the all-day, looking at different options that are good for the students of the community. And we've made it extended. And yes, you could go and roll the dice and extend it as far as possible and burn down whatever savings we might have, but that doesn't make strong fiscal sense. I mean, when we talked about the levies before, and we talked to the people that I know in the business community, that's not how they would run their business. And if you remember, we've continually heard that, to the extent possible, run the school like a good business. Well, the option that we're bringing you is what a good business would do. They're going to look at the options. How do I take advantage of what the government will give us, and that will be the state in this case, to allow us to mitigate what the taxpayers themselves will have to pay. And combining that with the good stewardship, we know we're going to have to use additional revenue, and not bringing it together, as Vaughn said, and force us to have a huge super issue, whether it's two within a year and a half. So it's good business planning, fiscal planning, that brings us to the recommendation we brought you. And we hope that we can, if there's anything else, we can be glad to answer it. Thank you very much.
So, John and Vaughn, thank you. Very much appreciated. I think that a couple of things that I've heard emphasized are, obviously, this levy itself goes beyond the realities of revenue stabilization for the district, which I see very much in line with a continuing or substitute levy. Right? We are now a landlocked entity in Westerville. And as a business person, if you can predict certain parts of your revenue over time, you can do a much better job of planning expense as well as revenue projections over the longer period of time. So that stabilization is extremely helpful, obviously, to the board and to the district and to our citizens, because we can minimize the number of levy shocks that result from that. I think that the inclusion of the ability to pick up on new construction is obviously extremely helpful. It's nice to see that our state legislature began to at least chip away at the, 4 times unconstitutional school funding model that's used by the state that the legislature has not addressed in whole. I'm glad, though, that they chipped away at the edges on that in common sense ways that work for our citizens. The big piece for this levy, obviously, is that there are unnecessary consequences that can be avoided around the 10 and the 2.5% relative to what impacts those would have to our taxpayers that come from us approaching this issue smartly. And we do not have to have that type of an impact on our citizens, and we do not have to increase taxes because we're continuing this levy. So I think all in all, those are things that resonate with me as a taxpayer. I think that our focus on the emergency levy being extended those additional years is a message around our stewardship. I love that you used that word. Stewardship has been a hallmark term for this board in the previous 2 cycles, relative to an operating reserve, relative to expenses not exceeding revenue. And that shows in our fiscal strength as well as in the awards that we receive from the auditor's office. So I think that all of these things add up well. I guess my request would be, Dr. Kellogg, that we move quickly to get to a final proposal stage. So that may be vetted in formal fashion with the board so that we can begin to communicate these recommendations or the recommendation to the broader community.
I appreciate that, Mr. Byrd. A couple specific to that, I think Mr. Griffith and I can prepare for the board the resolution that would need to review and act on in the coming board meetings so that we can get ourselves headed in the right direction. A couple things people may want to be aware of. 2 examples of similar levy options that occurred around us. Big Walnut 2 years ago, I believe it was, Same thing, passed. Delaware, just this recent election cycle, did similar. It is, of course, a renewal, which generally does pretty well on the ballot. The substitute one is a new one. It takes a little bit more explaining to, as we've seen, but I think it's a good option. The three things that came to mind to me were pretty simple. Maintain the district's revenue, retain the rollback for taxpayers, create more opportunities for kids. And that's the simplified formula for what I see coming out of that revenue from that committee. And I appreciate the time they put into 3 evenings, great conversations, talking to community members, and bringing us back great questions. I thought for Bart and I then I know Rick and Tracy were in the room as board members as well. It was good to hear the conversation. So, yeah, next steps, we can schedule with board leadership to bring a resolution to the board, and then look at the time frame that the state has for bringing the ballot forward. There's some time frame for that we'll have to look at as well. But this will give the community, by doing that now, if you're projecting to November, which is what I'm assuming we're doing, which means we're actually a year in front of the expiration, or when we stop the collection, but that doesn't affect, all it does is give us a runway to get it done and then begin planning from there. And the collection would start when the current one expires, so it doesn't change that time frame. But it gives us a runway with the community to say, to have lots of conversation about what does this mean, what does it mean for you. It also means, by going a little bit earlier than when it expires, that in case legislators get any notions about changing the rollback piece prior to going on the ballot, we beat them to the punch. Because don't forget, this is coupled by income tax decreases. This is a double-edged sword. Income tax decrease, but take away the rollback, right? So as a taxpayer, you beat the system, so to speak. So I think it gives us a great opportunity. So we'll start working on timing for doing that this spring.
Thanks, guys.
Yes, thank you very much. And to the rest of the committee as well.
And to Bart, who's not here, he did a lot of work
Bart
on the
did a lot of
final. I just sat there and made sure everybody got water and had name tags. Bart did the hard work, so appreciate that.